But if your organization is truly going to have an effective system for strengthening and synergizing your leadership team around a leadership model and in support of your organization's goals, this training can't be optional. So I love a quote that I heard a long time ago, and it has stuck with me. Optional training leads to optional results. And so when we're on a journey to greatness and we're improving and growing our organization and we are committed to that journey and we want momentum on that journey, then the learning that goes along with that can't be optional, or the results of that are going to be optional.
Welcome to Culture Change RX, the podcast for healthcare professionals that are committed to creating a thriving workplace culture, improving the experiences of employees and patients, and ultimately unlocking their organization's next level of potential. I'm Sue Tetzloff, your host and co-founder of Capstone Leadership Solutions. Join me and my insightful guests each week as we share actionable insights for navigating the crucial people side of the business of healthcare. Subscribe now for a weekly dose of Culture Change RX. Now let's dive into this week's conversation where culture change takes center stage.
Welcome. I'm so glad you're tuning in today to this Solo Byte episode on Culture Change RX. What a Solo Byte episode means, as you probably discovered, is that this is a bit shorter episode and I have no guests in the studio. So it'll just be me riffing on a specific topic related to the people side of healthcare. And today, my focus is on the area of creating a learning culture, and in particular, the leadership development part of your learning culture. And I'm going to frame it up in a way of kind of 3 things not to do, or 3 things that this learning system is not. And in the process of that, I'll share some tips and tricks of things that it is, or things that you can do to elevate your learning culture in the area of leadership. So the first thing that is not something that you want to do as part of your learning culture is to rely on people and experts from the outside. So we like to say that it is an inside job. And what I mean by that is that you have to own internally the systems and processes that create the learning for your leaders, right? So if you're dependent on that from the outside, that system doesn't create ownership. Now, you can rely on outside experts to help you set it up, to get you started. In fact, that's one of the things that Capstone Leadership does for our healthcare organizations that we partner with, is we help them set up those systems for ongoing education of their leaders and the onboarding of their leaders, even succession planning. So setting up those systems, those have to be internally run and owned systems, but you could maybe have somebody from the outside, an expert, help you. Especially we find small rural healthcare organizations, maybe they don't have that internal expertise, right? Maybe they don't have an OD department or experts in education or HR department that are really experienced and knowledgeable to be able to set up and optimize and run these learning systems for continually strengthening and onboarding your leadership team. So individual leaders and collectively the leadership team. So in creating that as an internal versus an outside process, is somebody needs to own it, right? So here's a tip, maybe a couple tips of how you can create that internal ownership of the leadership development system in your organization. And one is to have a steering team, a group of leaders, senior leaders, frontline leaders, really serving as the people that operate this process. They develop this process, they decide what our leadership model is going to be, and then they ongoingly develop and onboard leaders to that leadership model. So they get to make those decisions. So do it with them, not to them. So we like it to be a combination of both senior leaders and frontline leaders. So when we're partnering with a healthcare organization, one thing that we help them set up is this steering team. Now, it has other purposes too when we're working with an organization, but in particular, one of those primary purposes is to really strengthen the leadership of the organization. And one other way to make that really an internal process that serves your organization long term is to really make sure that you're removing those single points of failure where with one person leaving, the whole system falls apart. So the steering team helps to do that, right? Because it's a team that's responsible, not a single department or a single person that's responsible. But then also setting up who are your internal experts for training, mentoring, and supporting your leaders based on your leadership practices that you adopt in your model. In Capstone Leadership, when we're partnering with organizations, we recommend 9 core leadership practices and that they develop internally 2 or more internal, we call them peer champions. They sometimes change it and call it something else. But these internal experts that really become the expert in leading change, strengthening relationships, setting and achieving goals, improving communication, those kind of things that are part of the leadership model or the leadership bundle. So creating those internal experts so that you can onboard, so that you can ongoingly provide education, training, and support to all leaders on the core leadership practices that you've adopted. And then you've got a system for educating, etc. And you have the people that can man that system, right? So it's not an outside job, it's an inside job. And setting up this inside system, the process, and the people is a very important part of really supporting the ongoing involvement of your learning culture. The other thing that it is not is it's not episodic. So creating a leadership culture is not something you do once in a while. It's not a training event that's one and done and you think that, wow, we've invested in our leaders and now that means, we have a learning culture. So really it's, leadership development is a process, not an event. Now you may have some anchor events like in our partner organizations, these healthcare organizations, they might set up a signature anchor event like a quarterly leadership development process where they have these days where leaders gather together to learn and practice and process those core leadership practices or the things that are on their leadership development plan that are aligned with their organization goals and things that leaders need to learn to be able to help support the success of those goals in the organization. So it's not episodic. It's not one and done. It's this continuous learning process. So organizations that we've worked with now for 12 years in the history of our company, they set up this process. It's an inside job. They set up this ongoing process. It's not episodic. And there's this continuous rhythm and cadence to developing their leaders. So it's not episodic. It is continuous. And it's sometimes, more important what happens in between those quarterly leadership signature training events, the things related to the support, the mentoring, the accountability, the practicing, the processing, those kind of things that happen in between those signature events. That's actually as important or maybe more important to creating this learning culture and really developing and strengthening the leadership team. So some things you need to do here is to have a plan for maybe even a whole year ahead. So in our partner organizations, that's what their steering team is doing. They're planning a whole year ahead. What are the core learning needs that align with our goals for our organization, that align with our leadership model, and how are we going to weave these into those 4 signature events, and what are we going to do in between? And so really having that plan. And then also that calendar. So even setting up a calendar for those 4 signature events and any other things so that people can count on preparing for those if they're part of, that steering team or that internal peer champion group. and also the attendees counting on being there. So that gets to the next third point I wanted to make today, is that creating a leadership learning culture is these events being part of this process. If you're a leader, is not optional, right? It is something that is, we use the M word carefully when we're working with organizations and using that word mandatory. But if your organization is truly going to have an effective system for strengthening and synergizing your leadership team around a leadership model and in support of your organization's goals, this training can't be optional. So I love a quote that I heard a long time ago, and it has stuck with me. Optional training leads to optional results. And so when we're on a journey to greatness and we're improving and growing our organization, and we are committed to that journey and we want momentum on that journey, then the learning that goes along with that can't be optional, or the results of that are going to be optional. So you want the training to be mandatory, or certain events as part of that process to be mandatory. So in our partner organizations, one of the things we suggest to the steering team that's oversighting this whole process and these events and all of the activities in between these events is that only the CEO can excuse leaders from an upcoming training event. So they're so important. This investment in our leaders is so important that we wouldn't want anyone to miss out on that. And it's so important that if somebody is going to miss out on it, it is going to be the CEO that's going to say, yeah, the reason for missing out on it is a good one. Their daughter's getting married, they're getting married, those kind of things. But even like I said before, if it's not episodic and it's continuous, and you can pre-plan a year or more in advance when those dates are for very important parts of your process, like these signature events, then people can plan a lot of your, vacations and other things around that. Some things you're not going to maybe plan around that, but maybe you could. So yes, attending the training isn't optional, but maybe more importantly as well is that what you do in follow up to the training isn't optional either. So if there's key takeaways from the training, so we're really about learn, do. So learn and then put into practice. So these training events, if they're executed well and their objectives and the learning objectives for them are delivered well, then it should be very clear what leaders are to do and put into place and to implement in follow up to the learning. So, and they should know very clearly is some of the things that they're learning, maybe some tips and tricks to manage their time and energy, or to improve communication, or to build is some of this stuff that's delivered at this training, is it optional? You can consider if it will work for you. You can try it to see if it'll work for you. But are there things that are required or mandatory or not optional to take away? And we're all going to do them. So it becomes our leadership standard work. So this is how we lead around here. So if, for instance, training your leaders on a practice like employee rounding as part of the strengthening relationship practice in your leadership model, if that's not optional, leaders need to know that. So they're attending the training knowing it's not optional that I put this into practice. It's required. It's mandatory. It's part of how we lead around here. All leaders are going to do this, and this is how we're going to do it, how often we're going to do it. We're going to understand the what, why, and how. And if they go into the learning knowing that it's not optional and I will have to put it in place, they learn differently. They listen differently. They engage in the practice differently. And then afterwards, there needs to be those accountability pieces, those check-in, the support and mentoring in between these events. So leaders need to clearly know that training isn't optional, and they also need to know which takeaways, which practices to be implemented aren't optional. And so that's where we get that elevation in accountability, and we get that elevation in synergy where all leaders are leading in the same way. And that gets to be very synergistic in an organization. So 1 + 1 = a lot when all leaders are leading in the same way. So the steering team, that's one of the things that they do, is they really oversight not just that training day as far as who's there, whether it's optional that they be there or not, but also what takeaways are optional and which ones are mandatory to put into practice, because this is how we lead around here, and we're all going to lead in this way so it's synergistic and impactful for the entire organization and the entire group of leaders. So it's not an outside job, it's an inside one. It's not an episodic process, it's a continuous one. And both the training days and the takeaways, we have to know which ones aren't optional and which ones are mandatory that we must put into place and to implement. So there's our Solo Byte episode for today. I hope you got some great takeaways about what to do, what not to do in your organization as it comes to elevating your leadership learning culture. We'll see you next time on Culture Change RX. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for tuning in to Culture Change RX. If you found value in today's episode and you are a believer in fostering change in healthcare, join us in making a difference. Follow, rate, and review our podcast on your favorite platform. Share it with colleagues and your network. Together, we can make a lasting impact. Until next week, keep inspiring positive change.